welcome everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Wurundjeri land, the traditional owners of this land, of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and those yet to come, and acknowledge anyone who might have of any Indigenous background here. But it's a great pleasure to introduce this seminar, this question mark seminar that AII has been having. We have 4 themes around which we've been asking broad questions about the challenges facing different parts of the world, around infrastructure, health, education, and governance. And what we want to do is to address those global questions and issues and challenges through the lens of what's going on in India. And so today we have an excellent young dynamic group of people who will be having a conversation, a discussion about the future of work in the tech sector through the lens of India. My name, I should have introduced myself up front. I'm Priya. I'm the Research and Academic Programs Director at the Australia India Institute, and I have the great privilege of working with some of the brightest young postdocs and researchers who are focusing on various aspects of developments and changes in India. And today we have 2 of our researchers from the University of Melbourne and 2 of our visitors. We have Janaki, Dr. Janaki Srinivasan here on my left. Janaki has a background in physics, a master's in information technology, and a PhD in information systems and management from UC Berkeley. Her work is in the area of information-based development, policy, and design. Dr. Bidisha Chaudhuri here has a background, has her degree, bachelor's degree in sociology, and then a master's and a PhD in political science from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. And she's done much of her work on technology and governance, and has focused on various aspects of gender, e-governance, and is currently working on what is one of the most amazing projects in India, massive project of digital identification, Aadhaar. So she's working on that. We have Dr. Jonathan Bowles here on our left. He has a bachelor's from Cambridge and a master's and PhD from Oxford University in geography, and has been working in economic geography on the alternative energy sector in India. And his research interests are focused on clean energy markets, renewable energy transitions, bottom of the pyramid kind of capitalism that has been touted a great deal, frugal innovation in India, and entrepreneurship. So, and then we have here Dr. Fabio Mattioli. He's an economic anthropologist. He's at the School of Political and Social Sciences. And he has his bachelor's degree in political philosophy from the University of Florence, and a master's degree in anthropology from the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in France, and a PhD in anthropology from the City University of New York. And he's been working on the transformation of work regimes caused by the unequal proliferation of financial debt in various industries, and particularly in Central Europe. So basically, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background for the discussion. We're going to have Janaki and Bidisha talk a little bit from particular perspectives about the future of work as it's unfolding in India, and then Jonathan and Fabio will raise some comments and questions, and then we can bring everyone into the discussion. So we all know that, along with everywhere else in the world, India's technology industries are reorienting and reconfiguring themselves in relation to these developments in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of these disruptive new technologies. we know that that the things that the factors that drove India's advancement in the IT sector, starting from the mid 80s and particularly from the 1990s, has been explained in many ways through the kind of links between the Indian diaspora and the US and the technology centers in India, and also in terms of the labor arbitrage factor, where the Indian technology people had the skills to provide a lot of the software testing and development, and then where they managed to capture the largest section of the global market in software services was in the back office processing activities, and then for a while, I think many people in the world pretty much associated India with call centers and so on. So that's the kind of perspective that most people had and continue to broadly have about India's technology sector. What they don't realize is that over the past decade or more and more global technology firms and large Indian IT firms have had a huge amount of R&D and development of new technologies, and they are in fact part of this AI and machine learning revolution. So a lot of this is happening in India. So there are a whole bunch of shifts happening right now, including political decisions around immigration and visas and so on, in terms of the market for Indian professionals. That's happening in rich countries like the USA, UK, Australia, and elsewhere. And within India, you're having this whole push by the Indian government to emphasize growth of innovation, ecosystems, tech startups, entrepreneurship, and in some ways, Bangalore is seen as the kind of crucible where a lot of these activities are happening. It's supposed to have a very vibrant ecosystem for startups and innovation. That's where a large number of the international R&D firms are, and all the big IT firms in India, the big four or big five, they all have their headquarters, or pretty much most of them have their headquarters in Bangalore. So there are all these interesting things happening in India, and it's in this context that I think we want to explore this question of what is the future, future of work, as seen through this lens of the disruptions that are happening. So I'm going to hand it over to Janaki and Bidisha to kick off the discussion. So over to you guys.
So I'll kick this off. So one of the things, as Priya was mentioning, when we think about the Indian IT sector is of course software services and BPO kind of services. But one of the things that's been happening, especially over the last decade, is that there is a much broader range of work you can think of as being digital work, right? And what I'm talking about here is what we've come to know as the platform economy. So the Ubers of the world, the Airbnbs of the world, also sometimes called the shared economy, and so on and so forth. And why is this particularly important in India in terms of work that is very intrinsically tied to digital technology and IT is that there are over 7 million platform workers around the world, and the ILO has actually identified India as the one with the largest chunk of these workers. That's one part of the reason. And the other reason this is seen as such an opportunity in the Indian case is of course the extent of the unorganized sector in the Indian case. And we have some big figures here from, I'm drawing this from the NSSO 2011, which says 70% of the workers have no written contract. 6% only 6% are covered by state security schemes. 65% of urban workers have no social security entitlements, etc. So it is against this backdrop that something like a platform economy or workers who are associated with these platform companies comes into being, and that's why it's seen as so important, right? So it provides opportunities for many more kinds of workers, many kinds of jobs. 2015-16, Uber offered over 400, said it had over 400,000 drivers. Ola, which is a company like Uber, offers similar transportation services in the Indian case, and I think now in Australia as well. Had even in 2015-16 said it had 550,000 drivers and over 25 million users, right? So we are not talking about a small part of the economy. And as this gets larger and larger, one part of it is of course these opportunities, another is also within these jobs. We are talking about new kinds of training being provided, we are talking about new ways in which they get professionalized, right? So against this backdrop of the kind of opportunities that something like a platform economy offers, I just wanted to go through a quick set of 4 concerns that come up repeatedly when you start looking at research on these things. And we would basically like for this to be a conversation, so I'll make this really short and then we'll sort of come back and talk about it more. So one of the really interesting things here is that when people talk about the digital economy more broadly, they have said that the share of revenue that goes to investors versus workers tends to be very high on the investor side, right? So to what extent can we see that happening in the platform economy? So when we say that it's offering people jobs, it's bringing back revenues, who are these revenues going to? And like many of the concerns I raised today, these are going to be open questions. We have a little bit of data on it, but it's surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, it's hard to get data on any of these because you go and ask Uber and Ola, you don't necessarily know what share of it they get. You get these through interviews, we have some sense, but not a lot, and these have been changing. A second part, of course, is regulation, and what makes platform economies particularly hard to regulate, of course, is that Uber calls itself a technology company. It does not see itself as a transport company. And typically states have dealt with those domains within which they regulate. So if you can't regulate something that runs cabs as a cab company, what kinds of regulations do you need to frame and what are you going to miss out, right? That's been a constant battle around the world and India was no exception. Though interestingly in the state of Karnataka, which is where we are coming from, Uber was eventually regulated under the cab Act 2-3 years back. Another question then is also around questions of unionization, right? We know that even by form, these technologies, the fact that you don't have a bunch of cab drivers sitting in one physical location makes organization or talking about problems intrinsically harder. So then what does that mean in terms of their ability to organize and ask for the kind of bargaining that other occupations have offered. A third is, and I think this gets really interesting, we talk about how platform economies bring in certain kinds of professionalization, but who gets to decide what is professional, right? So there's a platform in India called, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's basically a platform that offers various kinds of domestic cleaning type services, plumbing, carpentry, and what they do is train some of these people. So they might already be carpenters, but they sort of give them a few more extra weeks of training on both the platform as well as the occupation itself. Now the question here is, when you talk to people who work with, one of the things they say is, we get training to be professionals, right? But then when you dig in deeper into what does it mean to be professional, very often the things that come out are that English speaking is very important. The idea of customer is king becomes critical, right? And you can see how this then leads to other questions around an economy which relies so much on ratings of users. So what if you as a worker don't necessarily agree with what the person who's given you a rating says? When we asked people this, they basically said, well, the customer is king, this is not something we push back on. So I think it's interesting to ask questions around what does it mean to professionalize, right? And relatedly, and this is sort of my last point, I'll end with this, is every time you professionalize or give a particular hierarchy to skills, some people win and some lose, right? So in this case, what might that look like? And one of the gender implications of this in particular is, again, coming back to the question, as many of you are familiar with India would know, home cleaning has traditionally been something that you hire female workers to do. Because of safety reasons, that they don't have women workers except as beauticians. And therefore, a lot of the house cleaning, though it's arguable, it is a slightly different kind of cleaning. It's not necessarily daily cleaning. A lot of this will be cleaning that involves certain kinds of equipment, deep cleaning, etc., are men, right? So similarly, Uber, of course, has all of its drivers, I think, are men, though of course there have been other cab aggregator platforms which have introduced women. But the question to ask here really is, as certain kinds of skills become elevated or you become professionalized and your definitions of professionalization change, what kinds of social groups, whether it's along gender or caste or regions, who are the winners and who are the losers in this entire economy? So I think these are some very interesting questions that the platform economy raises, as much as it brings about a lot of opportunities. And I hope we can discuss this more. Bidisha will now say a little bit about another aspect of digital work.
Yeah, so I'm going to focus what Priya just mentioned about artificial intelligence and machine learning based automation that are taking place in India. And before even I go to the issues that I want to sort of raise here, I just want to give you some context about what kind of automation I'm talking about and why it is so important to talk about it. So the Indian government published in 2018 June a report, a national strategy report, which is called AI for All. So, which means that they are looking at AI as a technology, as a next big technology, which will be important for economic growth, for social development, and they identify 5 sectors which are going to be the priority sectors for where AI technologies should be leveraged. So they are health, education, agriculture, smart cities infrastructure, and smart city mobilities, which is transportation. And this is on the government side that this is happening, so they look at it, this is a strategic sector to invest and push for. On the industry side, there is a recent report which is looking at futures of job in India in 2018 by Aspiring Mind, which is an independent company which does skill assessment across sectors. So they look at 3 kind of skills which has high potentials to be automated. First is information gathering and synthesis. Second is English language communication, and the third is agreeability. So jobs which requires you to conform to a certain routine on a repeated mode. And when they map these skill sets, which has the high potential of automation to functions across the industry, the jobs which are likely to be more automated or have the high potential to be automated are customer care, operations, accounting, and low-level IT jobs. And so this is the kind of context in which we are talking about. It becomes very important to talk about the future of work in India in the context of this automation. So I want to sort of open the discussion with 3 important issues which I see as worth discussing. First is this whole, one of the dimension of skill is not only the work that we do as part of our roles, but also the kind of responsibility that we have to perform that role. So how accountable I am to perform a task, which is, it's a traditional way of also looking at the skill set and the kind of, where do you stay in the whole hierarchy of an organization. So when you're talking about responsibility as a dimension of your skill, and when you're thinking of automation, the question here to ask is that what responsibility goes to the technology and what responsibility stays with the human being, how the responsibility is distributed. And this is very important, especially when if I take the example of health sector, which is recognized by the government as a priority sector. So the primary health care, the last mile service delivery people in India, which are also called auxiliary nurse and midwives, ANMs in short, So when digital technology first came to India, they were all given this smartphones and mobile phones, which should enable them to do their work better. But in reality, what we see that it actually more than as an enabler of their work, it was a mechanism to sort of supervise their performance, and they were the one it was an extra responsibility for them to digitize health records in addition to what they were already doing. So their responsibility was not transferred to the technology. Their responsibility actually became more also to run the technology, and the technology was a way to surveil upon them, right? So it really does not do the role that it was thought that it would be serving. The second point is also about, so all the documents, whether it's the industry document or the government document, identify AI as a disruptive technology. So that means it's going to disrupt a lot of things that are the state of the art. So when you think about state of the disruptive technology, and you're thinking of something like AI for all, which means you're also thinking about inclusion as an important aspect of these technologies. So disruption and inclusion, they always don't go very well if you're disrupting something. So most of the time we think about technologies as providing that infrastructure of doing or getting things done. But in particular case of disruption, you also need to look at human beings as providing that necessary infrastructure in the transition phase. And I say this from my empirical work, mostly looking at technology and governance. So I look at public service delivery and introduction of digital technology in public service delivery. One of the biggest issues, the technological infrastructure issue, is connectivity, especially in rural areas. So when the connectivity does not work, is these human intermediaries, they are the backbone for getting things done, to get that service to the last person or the beneficiaries. So we need to think about how we sort of incorporate this human infrastructure when we are trying to introduce a disruptive technological infrastructure. And the third point that I think is important to discuss, and this is very important for both the private sector and the public sector automation, is, I think it's all over the world, but even in India more so, skills or the occupation are very closely tied to your social identity. So what I mean by that women tend to perform, like Janaki already mentioned, right? Women tend to perform a certain kind of role. A certain caste tend to perform a certain kind of occupation. So when we are talking about automating jobs or automating job roles, we need to think about, it's not just an issue of skilling, de-skilling or reskilling of individual workers, but who these workers represent, what social groups these workers represent. So gender is of course a very important aspect, and we see this gender pattern not just like, as I mentioned, these primary healthcare professionals are mostly women. So when we automate health sector, these are the jobs which are going to hit by. So we are talking about not just health workers, but we are talking about women health workers being hit by it. But this is also very valid for IT sector, because we think, like in India, we proudly say that we have a lot of women coming into STEM, so a lot of women do engineering and science. And IT sector has been one of this unique sector where you have at the entry level almost 40% women joining the sector as workforce. But if you look at the data, aggregate level data, only 2% of IT company leadership positions go to women. So the gender inequality already exists. And if you look at the way the jobs are divided across gender within the IT sector, women, so for example, testing, which is considered to be one of the lower level of IT job, mostly done by women. So if those are the jobs which are going to be hit by automation, AI-based automation, so we are looking at not just certain workers being de-skilled, but we are talking about women who are already marginalized within a sector being hit first. And I think this is not just limited to gender just being one very important aspect to discuss, but this also, when you're looking at platform economy, this also the carpenters or plumbers, they are also performed by a certain caste. So how that sort of plays out, these are the important issues I think we need to sort of consider when you're thinking about automation in India. So we can maybe both of you have questions?
Okay, thanks very much. This is really interesting and really important points. I guess one of the things that's come out from both of your discussions so far is the gendered aspects of the sharing platform on automation, AI. I was just wondering whether you might say a little bit on how you see this developing into the future. Do you think that the companies, businesses, individuals who are involved in the sharing in the sharing economy or within AI automation, that they're aware of these issues, thinking about them actively, are concerned about it, and also whether the government in India is thinking about it, concerned about it, and are actually doing anything or what they should be doing? I was kind of interested as well. I mean, you've spoken a lot about all these new platforms coming, and I was wondering, I mean, coming back to the core question that we have of the future of jobs in the tech sector, I was wondering whether there are any kind of new professions that we're seeing emerging that are actually new and are creating new jobs. I mean, for example, the housekeeping sharing platform app or Uber, you could say that these are jobs that exist anyway and are maybe replacing or changing jobs that have existed before. Like a taxi driver who was just working by themselves might be working for Uber and it's a company capturing some of the profits now, but essentially it's not a new job, arguably. Or I don't know whether there's any data on the extent to which it's new jobs, but I'd be interested to know whether there are any new jobs emerging and what are the kind of skills that we're seeing associated with these new jobs or requirement for skills, and what. So that makes me think of two issues. I mean, you were talking first about kind of professionalism, and I was interested in the extent to which companies are actively involved in looking to skill workers as part of developing platforms, or whether they're not really doing that, whether these kind of platforms are developing alongside concerted efforts to skill workers within this context of India, where skills, a lack of formal skills and vocational education is seen to be a really crucial issue at the moment, whether it might actually be these companies who are going to be at the forefront of skilling India, or whether actually it's this whole emergence of sharing economy is just another area where the government needs to be thinking about how it can help in skilling, or whether, yeah, I'd be interested to talk a little bit about that.
Should I
Look at the shading.
Yeah. So if I start with your last question first, so definitely companies are interested in skilling, and I think I briefly mentioned they give, it's of course very platform dependent. You know that something has arrived in India as soon as it starts offering priests and puja services, which has happened with HouseJoy. So they offer two kinds of training. One is in the domain, and here again it depends very much on what kind of service you're looking at. So there's only one service where women are involved in HouseJoy, which is beauty services. And a beautician that I spoke to said that you know these things are very intertwined. So she would basically say, I was already a beautician. I knew how to say do a massage or a haircut or whatever, but now I also know how to do a massage better, right? So that's part of your domain specific skilling maybe. But the other part is definitely I know how to sell it to the customer, and I know how to politely put it across to them if there are any issues to be resolved, right? So the question here really is, you could call this professionalization, you could call it some upskilling. Definitely they are trained on how to use the platform. So that's a particular kind of a skill which you can abstract away from, in the sense that it's a certain level of digital literacy, but of course some of it is very platform tied. So in most of this there is very little data because the companies don't really offer it. So when I was trying to do interviews, I was sitting in their office interviewing their workers. Anything beyond that wasn't really possible. So that was to the first part of your question. In terms of the creation of new jobs, again, I think that it's tied to this question. When do you say a job is a new job, right? An Uber driver, to the extent that a driver earlier also used to drive a car, it's the same profession. But to the extent that the way they everything from the way they find their customer, the way they retain their client base, to how much they make, to the fact that they have to deal with this entity called Uber, it's completely different, right? Is that a new job or not? It's not entirely clear to me. It's definitely not exactly the same job, right? And especially with things like the priests who are being, whose services are being requested through the platform, I don't know, it feels like a very different kind of a profession. I'll just address the third thing and then I'll, which was around how are they thinking about including other people in it, working with the government, etc. So one agreement I think one of the cab aggregators had with I think the state of Telangana was to have an exclusive service where they trained female drivers.
Okay.
And I know there are a few other aggregator services which are specifically female focused. So there's definitely an awareness of trying to diversify some of this. But when your model is constantly dictated by investors, unless there is a tie-up like this with the state, it's not clear to me that they'll all translate. I would say the understanding that you have to bring in more people is there. I won't say that's lacking. But to what extent that will be backed up with investment is not clear to me.
Yeah. Can I just, on that last point, just to say, has the government, in any instances, the government identified it as a problem and kind of come in from a hostile position, seeing this as kind of a problem that it's only men being employed or that women are, and
that
actually actively intervened?
That I haven't seen. There have been some discussions around the customer being harmed, the whole Uber discussion, right?
Yeah.
So that's where the governments come in terms of they need to regulate, not necessarily around the worker.
Yeah, so when it comes, like the industry level data would talks about, like for example, NASCOM, which is an association for IT companies, they say that about by 2022, 46% of Indian will have a new skill set altogether. So, but I'm not sure what do they mean by when they say as, what are these new skill sets? And their prediction is out of this 46% new skill sets or people doing radically new jobs, 60% of them will be driven by AI and ML based technologies that they will have to have. So for example, they say that if you are a computer engineer, so from that you will move to something like vision engineer. So you will do only, you will use image processing and stuff like that. So the whole question of domain expertise will change. So I think it already started to happen. Like you have a data scientist and then who are working on a medical image processing project, and you will have one medical professional into that team. So it's the configuration of skills in a particular way is going to change. That's the projection by most of the reports. But another interesting thing, if you listen to what Janaki is saying, right, that the professionalizing means that you also have to communicate better and communicate in English. But according to industry report projection, English language communication is going to be highly automated in the industry. So the kind of skill you see already a lack of balance in what this and that is sort of talking about. So people maybe actually might have to, if they want to continue with their English language communication skill, they might have to leave the formal industry and maybe move to the platform economy or the sharing economy. So those are the kind of movements that you might see. On your issue of gender disparity or if the policymakers are cognizant of it, yet it is, because that's what, and these are the data that they, all these industry associations, they themselves collect. So they're very much aware of the gender disparity that exists, and I think in Indian context it's become even more worrisome because outside India the problem is there are not enough women in STEM. In India that's not at all a problem. There are enough women in STEM, and especially for IT industry you don't even have lack of workforce. The 40% of women are entering the workforce, but 8 years down the line there is the dip. So from 40% they come to 15% within 8 years of their career. So, and one of the things that are happening right now in India, that there are also a lot of global tech giants which exist, who are also job providers. So they actually brought this whole culture of having a more gender sensitive recruitment policy. So in our own placement experience, we see there are some companies which come and they say we want only women candidates. They don't even let the men sit for those. So we hope that those will also change the culture in the Indian companies and the way they address this issue. So there are, but we don't see much of it happening. I mean, I can think of Indian, the public sector policy has recent one last year which came up with the 6 months maternity leave policy, or having a creche if you have more than 30 women in an organization and all that. But other than that, there is not much proactive policies that you see. I think that I covered all.
So I was particularly interested in the interaction between the human and the technological infrastructures that you mentioned. And particularly because an anthropologist, that's one of the areas where I see a lot of my colleagues now getting employed. And so one of the first question is, as you know, now have things like self-driving cars, but you don't know how actually humans are going to react to them, or how the two infrastructure, if you want, two kinds of interpretations of situations and problems, etc., are going to collaborate or not in cases of, say, an emergency. Well, that sounds like a place where a lot of my colleagues are going to be working on, and in fact, you have places like Bidisha now hiring anthropologists, trying to figure out how humans and machines are going to collaborate. So a very basic question is that an area of expansion in India, or is it the place that doesn't attract that kind of technology or that kind of new jobs because of, say, assumptions about what should be located in India, especially from the perspective of international corporations? And then two, that to me sounds also as a pedagogical question. So if if you're like us in the business of shaping future minds and future also members of societies and people who have to survive in the future as well, the question becomes, how do we make what we teach today relevant in the future, right? We don't know what's going to come next. We don't know the kind of jobs that are going to be available. We don't know the kind of skills that are going to be required for those jobs, because some of them are just too far ahead. And so the question becomes, how do you make sure that the two infrastructures are going to be still in sync, if you want, or that what we do is relevant for the future in that sense? And I know you've been involved in a very exciting master programs as well. And I wanted to know, some of the kind of reflections you've been maturing through that trajectory as well.
Yeah. So yes, so this whole configuration between the human and the technological infrastructure, the way the different sectors are addressing it in a different way. So you see this configuration happening a lot when you're looking at small scale startup sort of ecosystem. So there are more and more demand for skills who not only just good at the technology but also understand social sciences, right? So that's where our master's program is placed. I'll talk about that in a minute. But before that, but the same configuration you don't see in so much in public sector. In public sector, what we see actually, for example, as Priya mentioned, I work on Aadhaar a lot, right? And my previous work before Aadhaar has also been looking at technology and governance. So what we see that there is this much more faith in technology, in delivering certain things. So it's always about technology substituting human beings or replacing human beings to make the system more efficient, right? So that's the kind of interventions that you see when we are talking about large-scale governance projects. And Aadhaar also is one of that. Like, one of the reasons Aadhaar was pushed for public welfare services is that there is a huge leakage, or they wanted to reduce leakage of state resources. They want to get rid of the middleman. And I think recently our Prime Minister has this quote, right? I make sure that I remove all the middlemen and make sure that every beneficiary get what they deserve. And so he identifies middlemen as being the problem in getting public services. So that's more or less the point of departure in public sector, where technologies are deployed in a large scale. But if you're looking at the small scale, as I said in the startup, that's not the case. They're more and more identify the complexities, because and also the point here in the startups, they're looking at technologies which are much more ubiquitous part of our life. So let's say an app which is on your phone, which is part of, it's not a phone just to communicate, it's you do pretty much everything through your phone. So when you getting into such complex relationship between users and the technology, then you have to think about this human infrastructure and the technology infrastructure in a much more complex way, rather than one substituting the other. So that's the difference. And yes, so this is what we see that we started this master's program 3 years ago, which is called Masters in Digital Society, Master of Science in Digital Society. So we also, as being a tech school, we also have a regular engineering program, which is in computer science and electrical engineering. And we introduce humanities and social science courses for these students. And we actually saw that they get really, you see their progress. Like when they take the first course, they have a lot of questions that why do we have to do this? I clearly chose engineering, why do I have to do social science? But as they complete about 4 courses over the period of the 4 years that they stay with us, many of the students actually, you see that warm up. They see what's the point of learning all these things for their own work as engineers. So it's not that I'm trying to convert them into social scientists, you can still remain engineers. And we also had a lot of interaction with industry, and we see this sort of lack of, or the gap of skills, where they sort of understand both. So they also don't want like pure social scientists who do not understand the technology. We black box the technology and say that we just look at what happens after. So they wanted students, they were interested in students who would have both, knowledge of both. And that was one of the motivations for which we thought we should start a program. And and it's a mixed cohort, so we take students from any disciplines, any undergrad disciplines. So we have people coming from design, people who are coming from literature, people who are also engineers, people who have a communication background. So we have students from all of these. And our curriculum is designed in an interdisciplinary way. So they do learn programming, they learn how to do coding, and they also learn how to define a problem statement. When you're designing technology, how do you assess what is the need? And this whole concept of that, you don't replace human beings with technology, but you create a new kind of relationship when you introduce a technology between the human beings and the technology. And it is very important to understand how that relationship, like what role you see for each of these in that new relationship, and how they can sort of shape each other in a more positive and a constructive way, rather than one sort of dictating the other.
Especially because coding these days might be replaced by AI, right?
Yeah,
so you don't really need necessarily coders,
exactly.
but you still need people who then design AI or identify the problems within it. Right?
Exactly, and also they understand that this whole question of algorithmic opacity or algorithmic transparency, what's the implication of it? For that you also need to understand the ethical issues, but also understand what is an algorithm.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of skills. Maybe you, Janaki, want to jump in and talk more about the program?
Not so much the program, well maybe I'll come to that, but one thing I was also thinking was what you were saying about the government and how perhaps they haven't shown as much interest. I think I'd agree that in the design phase not so much, but I think the way these things traditionally tend to be truncated is you're thinking about the design and evaluation as separate things, right? And one thing they do tend to be, the government does tend to be interested in, is why are things not working out the way we had claimed they would. And therefore in that sense I think the government is still hooked in, and we are very much, and as an institute I think we do interact with the state and state officials a lot. In terms of the curriculum, yeah, definitely part of the reason for, of course everything Bidisha says about having both sets of skills and is very critical. But the other thing that happens when you have a mixed cohort, I think, is that these people start to learn to speak to each other. For anyone who's been to a meeting which has social scientists and engineers in it, you realize how important that is, right? Like at least the initial few meetings are always about the engineers sort of saying, why are these guys always trying to problematize things and why can't they just solve a problem? And I'm sure equally with the social scientists making similar comments. So what we want going forward is for conversations to happen, right? There is a rationale why engineers think the way they do and social scientists think the way they do. And what better way than for them to have that conversation and see what that rationale is and then work together. So the whole idea of having a mixed incoming cohort for us was very important and also fairly new in the Indian case where we are at undergraduates and even masters tend to be fairly focused, right? So it's not, for example, like in the US you have you might be able to choose your major 3 years into your undergrad, so you do have some exposure to other disciplines. That's not the case in India typically. So that was one of the reasons, and we are very pleased with how the program is going, and it's very exciting and keeps us on our toes.
I think he had a question.
No, I was just going to say, often when you're providing that perspective from humanities or social sciences, it's seen as a non-expert perspective because it seems to be, it's perceived as a kind of opinion or, I mean, even though it's grounded in research, the ideas are themselves seen as non-expert, popular perspectives. So I was just responding to that.
No, I think, should we take some questions if people have any questions?
I was just going to perhaps ask one of the questions to kick it off and perhaps open it up, and that is, could you actually right now, based on, I know your program is really young and new, but in terms of, say, the big firms, you mentioned some startups, and where are these now, these kind of newly skilled products, or graduates of your program, where are they being, are they finding jobs, are they in great demand, which, are they the big global firms like Microsoft, or, are they the big Indian IT firms like Infosys or TCS, or are these guys just going straight into the entrepreneurship sector, just some idea so that people can then, do it.
Yeah, that's a word. Trying to think where.
So we should clarify that we have small cohorts, and we just started 3 years ago, but some of the places they've been going to, it's a mix of some of those. One of our students has a startup of her own which she's been working steadily through the last couple of years called Vision Empower, which is basically trying to develop pedagogical material for teaching science and math to visually impaired students. So that's something that she's set up, and part of her training and work was with Microsoft Research, which has a lab in Bangalore. So there are these collaborations, and then she's setting up this firm. We have a couple of students who work in a startup called Everwell, which is looking at technologies to distribute the TB medication continuation regimen, which is a big problem in the Indian case because people quit taking their tuberculosis pills. So how do you use technology to ensure that they do? That's a few. Then there are people.
3 of them went to a bot company. So they built bots for, so they use existing platforms to build bot for different kinds of applications. So this specializes in, so few of them went there.
Was there some sort of a gaming, I remember seeing, what would they call, some fields of vision?
Fields of view.
Yeah.
Well,
That was a startup incubated from our institute.
IIIT, not this program so much. So they actually create games for public policy. So that's a firm that's actually done well.
Another student went to eGov Foundation, so which
Yeah.
basically builds application for governance, public service, municipal services in few states in India. They also do a lot of data mining and use this data for them figuring out what sort of applications they should build for municipal government. One
For the
a
most
news,
part,
news aggregator.
Daily
Yeah.
Hunt, right?
Yeah.
So a news aggregator. So for the most part, we have also tried to encourage them to go to newer kinds of companies which are looking at newer kinds of problems and ways of thinking about them. So I think a lot of them have gone to smaller, newer companies. But as far as we can tell, they seem to have been enjoying their roles. We had one guy who works with the World WRI, the World Resources Institute, which looks at one of the things it looks at is questions of urban transport. And he was doing some work. His thesis was around open mapping, and he was trying to connect that up to issues of urban transport. So those are a few I can think of.
Yeah, even for large companies, they have now started these small initiatives, right? So, for example, Everwell is a sister concern of Microsoft
Research.
So, where I think these students fit very well. So, they actually get into a big company, but not in the usual roles of those companies, but the small initiatives which look at this new kind of skills.
So does TCS and Infosys also do things like that, or are they adopting a very different approach to these new disruptive trends?
What's this? I don't know. TCS.
I think the service companies haven't explicitly spoken about this so much. When we were starting up this program, we tried to reach out to a lot of people in the industry. And I think from a lot of the product companies and especially the multinationals, we got a lot of positive feedback saying how this is going to be a skill set that's going to be increasingly in demand. I'm not sure the services company was so embracing of it at that time. I don't know if things have moved on.
But thank you so much. I guess we should now open it up to questions from our group. Yeah.
It was great to hear you speak. As you describe the things that you were describing, particularly the Uber one is the one that really strikes me, because for every successful Uber there's a failed taxi, and I'm not saying that taxis were great, but what it sounded like you were describing, or what I was hearing through that, was social decomposition. So society, certain of the things that certain aspects of social cohesion failing, as people are less able to rely on traditional ways that things are happening. Have I misheard that? Is society all happy and cohesive, or are things getting a bit worse? And are there any metrics around that?
I think the last question is definitely the easiest to answer. I don't know if there are metrics, and I don't know if there can be metrics that will take such a profound question and reduce it to a number, right? I think it's very hard to say. I think that's a great question. One of the things I was trying to say is that of course, we have all heard critiques of the platform economy and how, while they deliver certain kinds of jobs, they make others unavailable, etc. I think the Indian context is, and I'm sure the context of many other countries, is complicated, because it isn't as though a lot of these people had secure jobs before, right? So it might be a horrible choice to have to make, but not every Uber driver so there are all kinds of profiles of people who become Uber drivers, right? Some of them might have driven other kinds of cabs. There are definitely stories of people who sold farmland and came in and drove Uber, where what you're saying about social cohesion might be truer. I don't know if it is for the guy who was already a cab driver. And the thing is, these things have also shifted very drastically over time. So the first 2-3 years when Uber started operating, I think the drivers were actually very, very happy. I mean, and anyone who's visited a place where Uber runs knows this, right? Like, you invariably have that chat with the driver, and those conversations have shifted so much, even in my own memory, over the last 2-3 years. Not to mention newspaper reports, and now, earlier there was no Uber Ola union. The last year they started a union, and that's for a reason. So Well, I guess I don't have a clear answer to what you're saying, but in some ways, obviously, people's earlier forms of even the societies they integrated into or who they were cohesive with has definitely shifted. There has been some level of migration. It's hard to say if that's only because of Uber or Uber merely was one kind of job because of which they migrated. They might otherwise have migrated for other reasons. So I guess I don't really have a good reason. One thing, I think the interesting thing about the platform economy is also the fact that a lot of us are users, isn't it? So there are also constantly insights that you arrive at through that. And one thing I've definitely realized just being a user is that when you just order things rather than having a relationship with the person who's providing you a service, that definitely makes for a very transactional relationship. I definitely feel like when I don't know the person who's delivering my food, my ability to get frustrated with their service is much higher. I have no human regard for someone who's delivering it in those ways. So I think in some of those ways you might be hitting on something, but I think we'll definitely have to wait a slightly longer time before we could definitively answer.
That's a good research idea too.
Yes, definitely. That's true. That's true.
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, Dolly?
I really enjoyed this talk. Oh my gosh. So I'm just wondering about what you have to say regarding the definition of being professional. I found it really fascinating, and I think it's linked to skill. And so I think I'm reading that there's kind of a detachment on what it means to be professional in this the house joy environment. I see that there's a transformation happening both between the service provider and the service receiver. So in the context of India, how do you see this panning out? Do caste, class, everything, does it come into play in general?
Yeah, I think it definitely comes into play. What I am also seeing in terms of shifts is what a profession will begin to look like, right? Like I was mentioning with the whole reliance on customer ratings, for example. So there's now a set of rules of how you ought to behave with someone who's hiring your services. So I definitely wonder what that transaction will start to look like. I'll give you a very small example, right? This whole idea of surge pricing on these cab aggregators, right? When you ask people in India why they prefer Uber, and by the way, I'm totally complicit in this. I take Uber, so I know there are people who take a stand. I do take Uber, I accept. One of the reasons that people often say they take it is because you don't have to haggle with an auto driver, right? Because they will quote you something, whereas what Uber does is it matches demand and supply scientifically, and then if there's too much demand, it gives you a surge price. And I'd usually ask them, but the auto driver was doing the same thing and all in his head, right? He knew that you really needed the service right now. He knew what his costs were and what he was going to take that time and give you the ride. So why is that dishonest, whereas this is just smart pricing, right? So that's something that I also mean by professionalization. So we already have certain ideas about who a professional driver is, and now you have an option where you can take a more professional option. So I do wonder what that will do going forward to how we interact with cab drivers, or that's one aspect. I think gender is definitely another in terms of which professions get connected to what gender. I don't know how regional, for example, in a place like Bangalore, you sort of know that traditional plumbers will come from certain parts of the country, carpenters are typically from another. I think we'll have to wait and watch how some of those pan out. Does that sort of address what you're saying?
And do you guys relate anything of this professionalizing to something called soft skill in the corporate industry?
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Just to follow up on this point, it makes me think of my own work looking at the electricity sector in India, and obviously in India suffers huge problems from high losses in the electricity sector, which is associated with corruption often and issues like that. And when you talk to people in the sector, technology is the one thing that people constantly refer to is that like through technology, this is how we're going to solve intractable problems around corruption, people stealing electricity, relationships between officials and consumers of electricity, that if only we can have technology in there, then we can get rid of all these kind of jugaad situations or improvised corrupt situations. And I was just wondering whether you see technology as kind of providing solutions to some of these really big like problems around corruption or everyday situations that make life really difficult for everyday people, or whether actually it's kind of a very dystopian vision at the
No,
moment.
but that's the point I was making earlier, that technology is supposed to solve some of the problems that human beings necessarily bring, which is one of them is corruption, leakages in state resources and all. But it really doesn't work that way. And also, how do you define corruption is also very problematic, right? So that is exactly the right example. If a big company is giving you a receipt for charging you the double fee, you're fine with it because you don't see it as corruption or malpractice. I mean, for example, with Uber, there was actually, the court tried to intervene at some point that surge pricing was banned. This is just 2 years ago. It came back. They found a way to go around it and came back. So, and because surge pricing sometimes go like triple the price you pay for going the same distance. And this, I don't know if this is true or not. This is a student of mine told me that if you go to from, point A to point B on a regular basis, they figure out that these are the two places you can't compromise on. You will have to go, either one is your home and one would be your work. So if you're looking for a cab between A and B, you get always a higher price. There is no surge pricing, it's always a high price. So they figure these are all techies, right? So they figure out they don't put, every time they change the location, the B, to a nearby place.
Yeah.
So then they get a lower price. So this is how the algorithm sort of works. And so do you call this corruption or not? So I think corruption is a very slippery sort of a thing to address, not just with technology, I think with anything. Because we never agree on what is corruption.
On that point, I was thinking about things like Airbnb, which in my opinion, provide people with choice, right? You have lots of people offering services at lots of different prices, different house for different price, but you can kind of get a sense, you have more information about what the market is like, and so I sort of feel, as a consumer anyway, that I can make choices there, and I can choose not to pay the mega hotel chain the ridiculous amounts of money they're trying to charge me, because I know I can stay in a little flat next door that's costing half as much, and that's a fair price because other people are also sort of asking roughly the same thing. So in a way, there's democratization of information that's provided, at least from the consumer perspective, through these technologies. I don't know how that plays in with these sorts of issues.
I think one thing we should definitely clarify is, even though this entire unwieldy beast is called the platform economy, obviously there are many, many different kinds of things being offered through it. By definition, something like Airbnb would be, I'm speaking about it from the people who supply the house, right? This is a very different class of people than Uber drivers. It's definitely true in India, right? So I think the politics that comes into play is definitely very different. Of course, one of the battles that we have been seeing about Airbnb, which is in common with what we were speaking about, is the issue of regulation, right? This has come up around the world in terms of taxation. What about someone takes up a house only to rent it out, which was not the original premise with which this went? How does it affect the economy in other ways, the hotel economy, etc., etc. So there are all those questions. But the other point I wanted to make was, it's always a different perspective from the customer and the worker's point of view, right? So given that we're speaking mostly from the worker's point of view here, I think it's not surprising that that's a slightly different way of looking at it. So that's something.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, please.
One issue I haven't heard a lot about is displacement. I think this is a headline issue from a popular perspective and a press perspective. And since we've been switching back and forth between this topic of AI and platform economy, which aren't exactly the same, but I think there are displacement issues in both of those cases. You know, AI obviously in automation displacing lower skilled workers, and then on the other side, the platform economy allowing new entrants into a market to displace the traditional providers in that market, whether it's driving or hotels, etc. So then I wonder, is there any broader consequence? First of all, is displacement something that anybody's concerned about, and do you view it as likely? And further to that, is it on the policy radar screen to consider numbers of people being unemployed, how are they going to be taken care of, and what are the kind of knock-on effects of that?
So just to clarify, by displacement you mean people being jobless?
Pushed out.
Yeah.
Pushed out.
Yeah, so that's a big concern, and that's why I don't know if it's a big concern for the companies, the private companies, but when you're talking about AI-based automation in public sector, that's the biggest concern that the government is sort of grappling with at the moment. And platform economy, I mean, you can speak on it, but I see that has been sort of projected as something which is providing these jobs, right, which are taken by formal sector. Platform economy is sort of creating new jobs for people who were otherwise not able to find a job. But yes, I think displacement is a big problem when it comes to in the formal sector, especially in the industries. And we see that the government has, that's why it's a lot more cautious in sort of going forward and implementing, because for them they also have to gain some sort of popular legitimacy, right? You cannot just get rid of jobs. But they do see that not so much maybe unemployment, but people will have to reskill themselves when this automation happens. So training people is going to be a big investment from the government side. Training the existing workforce. And here that's what the point that I think both of us were making. Here what would be important to see that how different other social categories become important when you reskill people. So age, for example, this we can talk about from the history of automations. This is not the AI based, but if you look at the history of automation, if you're talking about computerization of banks, let's say in 80s and 90s, a lot of people who lose out, who are the losers in the whole battle, are the slightly older employees, because their government doesn't want to invest on training those people because they are maybe will retire in 5 years or 8 years, and one of the policies was you give them a handsome compensation and let them go. So that has always been a case with automation, that certain group of people become more vulnerable when reskilling sort of happens. So that's, but in the industry, I don't think that's going to be the issue if there will be direct job loss.
And I think the government has set up a couple of programs which are looking specifically at skilling, both the Digital India project initiative as well as Skills India? Skill India is another program where they're trying to address this, but I think the harder thing to grapple with here is it's not like there is a laundry list of 5 skills in which if you skill people there's a guarantee that it's going to give them a job, right? So I think that's part of the quandary here. Simon?
Yeah, more of an observation, but perhaps you could comment. You mentioned before that Narendra Modi sort of attacked, or was sort of saying that how it would be removing the middleman, but it seems in the private sector with Uber you're actually creating a middleman, using technology to create a middleman, whereas in one instance you're using technology to remove a middleman. More of an observation, but I don't know if you can comment on that, or if that's not the right way to look at it.
I actually don't like. I think it's not just about what Narendra Modi said, but that has been the take on digital technologies when it comes to governance, that the middlemen are the problem, which Jonathan also mentioned, this whole issue of corruption. So the middlemen are thought to be the root cause of corruption when it comes to public services, and hence the technology is thought to be or considered as a way to remove those. And I don't see a contradiction actually when you look at the, at least from their point of view, the same people, if they look at technology as the disintermediating human beings, if that's the goal. Uber and all this platform economy sort of serves that role, because here the technology, the app becomes the intermediary, which actually removes the human intermediaries. So you are again looking at technology being that, playing that role of intermediation, or playing that role of middleman.
So
And that gives that objectivity or that neutrality sort of a thing to the app.
So the haggling part of the mediation at least is lost, right? And if you look at the other side, I mean, even something like Aadhaar, even though it was supposed to be about removing a certain kind of a middleman, it was in the deployment of Aadhaar itself, whether it's the enrollment agents, etc., that other middlemen were purposely created and inserted in the process. So to me, that is more of a contradiction within the same initiative, I think.
And it is just not to Aadhaar, this is happening since 2001, 2004 onwards, right? The whole push towards e-governance when it all started, late 90s and so. This has been like, and irrespective of who is the Prime Minister, this has been the, our position as if you could say that all of them represent one entity called India, it has been the overall position of the government that middlemen are the problem, and we need to get disintermediation of human beings as service provider is the way to go, whether it's a private services or public services. But in a way, you created more middlemen.
We'll end with one last question from you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your discussion on platform economy and unorganized sector issues, and giving the Uber as the example. We already discussed at length what I think, but one thing which I really applied with an example from Australian economy, where Uber has come in, and then the so-called taxi plates, which used to command some monopoly price, is dead. So that's a great achievement for the economy, because so much of dead weight loss is gone. Now it's more, as I say, more market players in Uber setup, and therefore the so-called controls, invisible controls, which he had because of the some taxi cabs, for example, were owners, and therefore they had a lot of control over how much income they can get to themselves. And once the Uber has come, they had lost their monopoly, and therefore the economy is able to free itself from the monopoly issue there. And there I would like you to look into what is happening in Indian situation, because the taxi industry is itself unorganized there as compared to Australian economy. It's less regulated. You can see the taxi cabs under the tree, and then they operate the taxi. They just need the telephone line, that's it. People call them and then they come to your doorstep. Whereas it is different here. Cabs are different, one-way cabs are different. They are more regulated here. It is unregulated there. So the deadweight loss could be different there. However, with the introduction of Uber in India, some of those taxi cabs vanished from under the tree, and then they have set up their new cars, and then they got the license from the Uber company, and then they are able to serve the public. The other thing which you might be able to interested to collect the information on how it is benefiting the public at large or the customer at large. I am paying more to the taxi driver under the old scheme. I am paying less to the Uber company. This is a important difference to prove that Uber is doing better than the taxi cab economy before, because the consumer is benefiting. The consumer surplus is more in this case of Uber as compared to under the taxi cab economy before. So this is another point which you can think of.
No, I think those are absolutely important points. I think what we were trying to get at, and I think I tried to get at this a little bit with the Airbnb example. I think what the consumer gets is very different than what the cab driver gets. So that's something we must distinguish between. Even for the consumer, I would say that the amount I benefited or the amount of difference there was between a regular cab and an Uber cab 3 years back has steadily diminished and now come to a point where in fact I'm paying more for Uber. But what has happened is that my imagination of how I take a cab and the fact that when I call it, it should be at my doorstep rather than me hailing it or calling a number has become very set, right? It's become a habit for me. Unless I see that 10-minute away thing, I don't feel like I'm hiring a cab. So that has definitely shifted. But even within, in terms of the monopoly breaking that you're talking about, of course it's different even within India. There are cities which have unionized Kali Pili or yellow black cabs. Others like Bangalore never had it. So I think that makes a difference. But in terms of the fares that Uber is able to offer, I think it is important to see where that difference is coming from, right? How is it that in the first couple of years, they were able to offer me that kind of a difference between the price they were offering versus what the cab company was offering? And the answer here, of course, is that they have deep pockets, right? So they can take care of that difference for the first couple of years. The third year that changes, right? Which your local monopoly can't. So maybe part of what they were charging was overcharging because they were a monopoly. But maybe part of it was if you operate anything for 5 years, that's what it will average out to. Right, so I think
I think we do need to wrap up.
I just had digitalization.
No, you can chat
in
afterwards.
the area of education. Probably this could instill more discussion for later.
Yeah,
seminars.
later on. That would be lovely. You
That's
can
the
have
only
a
thing. That's what I
other
wanted to
chat.
say.
But
I can
I
talk
think-
to you later. No,
yeah, we could
Yeah.
have the chat.
But
You want
I'd
me?
like to really thank you guys for a wonderful, stimulating discussion. Fabio, Janaki, Bidisha, Jonathan. This is just really enjoyable and really grateful to you. So please, if you would like to catch up and ask them other questions about
Yes.
IIIT.
We would like to have your contacts. That's what
Absolutely.
is going to be.
And about their programs, you're most welcome to, but I think we'll call it to a close. Thank you very much for attending. And
Thank you
thanks
so much for having us.